שלום לכולם וברוכים הבאים לעוד סרטון של שפות עם יאיר. My name is Yair, and today we're going to be looking at the Hebrew language in depth. As many of you know, Hebrew is the language I consider myself to be the most proficient in, and after over 4 years of study, I recently fully completed and mastered the Hebrew course on Duolingo. Although I wasn't using Duolingo for Hebrew very consistently, and I was using many other resources to study Hebrew. This video is designed to be a comprehensive guide to everything you need to know about Hebrew, its history, its features, and what you should also do if you want to learn Hebrew yourself. So to begin, you've probably heard that Israel is the only country in the world to speak the same language, follow the same religion, and have the same people that it did 3,000 years ago, beginning with the Kingdom of Israel in 1000 BCE to the modern state of Israel today. However, as I'm sure many of you know, there wasn't an independent Jewish state in the region for the last 1,800 years or so, and Hebrew has been a dead language for around the same time as well. When I say dead language, I mean it only ceased to be spoken natively, but the fact is that Hebrew has been used continuously for the last 2,000 years, even after people stopped speaking it natively. Let's take a look at the timeline to put the history of Hebrew into perspective. So the earliest possible date we have for something that is identifiably Hebrew is probably around 1300 BCE. And of course, Hebrew still exists today. Specifically, the period of time Hebrew died fully was somewhere around 200 CE, and it would remain like this up until the 1880s. Some might say 1882, as this is the year that the first native Hebrew speaker, Itamar ben Avi, son of Eliezer ben Yehuda, was born. Hebrew had already effectively died before 200 CE, from around the early 1st century CE until its official death in the early 3rd century. Aramaic had already replaced Hebrew as the language of the Jewish people, and the only native speakers to exist were those who lived in the very southernmost outreaches of Judea. Aramaic was already being used in prayers alongside Hebrew, and Greek was being used in administration. Hebrew was already considered an ancient language by this point. The Tehillim of King David were written around 1000 BCE and are considered some of the oldest texts in the Bible. About 400 years after that came the Babylonian exile, and this is when the Jews were first introduced to Aramaic. But it's also when Hebrew adopted the Aramaic square script, confusingly called the Assyrian script, despite being used for Aramaic. This is because Aramaic was made official by the Neo-Assyrian Empire, which preceded the Neo-Babylonian Empire. The main texts of the Bible, including the Torah itself, were written down during the exile, as much greater importance was put on recording these texts. It is believed that much of the Bible was probably written before in the Paleo-Hebrew script, but these texts were not only temporary and lost to time, but also less accessible than the Bible is today. Much later, around the 1st century CE, we have the Dead Sea Scrolls, which actually reflect some changes that were likely taking place in spoken Hebrew at the time that are not reflected in other pieces of writing that are more concerned with linguistic purism. After the Roman exile, over a period of around 400 years, the Talmud was written. I've put the date at around 500 CE, as this is roughly when the main bulk of the Talmud was written. Though the Babylonian and Jerusalem Talmuds were both written in Judeo-Aramaic, they contain large sections of Hebrew too. They effectively code switch, and the Hebrew present in the Talmud is recognizably different than Biblical Hebrew, even though it existed purely as a literary and liturgical language by this point. Then, for the next millennia, certain texts like the Masoretic text and the Shulchan Aruch were composed, each displaying more innovative forms of Hebrew, though still strictly based on the biblical language. Over this time, due to the lack of Hebrew being a spoken language, radical changes in the form of sound shifts and word shortenings did not happen, as you would expect to see in most languages. But certain evolutions in grammar occurred, and of course new vocabulary had to be expanded for new concepts over time. This led to most of the differences that we see between Biblical Hebrew and modern Hebrew today. Contrary to popular belief that modern Hebrew was reconstructed completely from Biblical Hebrew. Breaking down the different stages of Hebrew is quite difficult, but I've attempted it here. Firstly, we have Archaic Hebrew, which I will talk about soon anyway, but basically it applies to some of the texts found in the Bible which seem noticeably older than the rest. Then from around 1000 BC onwards, we have Biblical Hebrew, or Classical Hebrew, which forms most the corpus of Hebrew in religious Jewish instances. This is the variety of Hebrew most commonly studied aside from modern Hebrew. Then in the last few centuries, I want to highlight late Biblical Hebrew, which was mostly a spoken form, but as I mentioned, does make an appearance in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Both phonemic changes and grammatical evolutions took place during this time. Post-mortem, Hebrew became solely a liturgical language, and this period, especially during the Talmud, is known as Mishnaic Hebrew, often referred to in Hebrew as Lashon Chazal. After the Talmud, the next stage is sometimes referred to as Masoretic Hebrew, which backs onto medieval Hebrew, though sometimes these two are put together. This is the Hebrew of the Rambam, Rashi, and Harav Sa'adia Gaon, and later Yosef Karo. During the 18th century, however, the Haskalah, or Jewish Enlightenment, led to Hebrew increasingly being used in more secular contexts, and new words and phrases were coined by Hebrew writers of the time. This pre-modern stage is sometimes called the literary revival of Hebrew, before Ben Yehuda initiated the spoken revival of Hebrew, which led to the modern stage of Hebrew. However, modern Hebrew developed in several stages. Firstly, with the initial generation that learnt Ben Yehuda's Hebrew in Ulpanim. Secondly, by increasing numbers of Jewish immigrants interacting with the first generation of native speakers. Thirdly, with all their children post-independence from 1948 onwards, and arguably a fourth stage from 1990s onwards, with the arrival of hundreds of thousands of former Soviet Jews. There are three main forms that people today will come across for the most part: Biblical Hebrew, Modern Hebrew, and Talmudic Hebrew. It's interesting to note that Poetic Hebrew, a register within Modern Hebrew, is based heavily off a mix of Biblical and Lashon Chazal, whereas most everyday Modern Hebrew grammatical patterns and vocabulary are much closer to the literary Hebrew of the last 1,000 years. So let's go back for a second to the early days of Hebrew. I've mentioned it on my channel before, but the earliest physical evidence we have of Hebrew are the Ketef Hinnom plates, a pair of silver tablets with the Birkat HaKohanim inscribed upon them. They are radiocarbon dated to roughly 600 BCE, and as you can see, they're actually written in the Paleo-Hebrew text. While the priestly blessing is thought to perhaps be the oldest prayer in Judaism, perhaps only slightly younger than the Shema, there are thought to be songs in the Bible that are older. Some of these are the Song of Deborah on the right and the Song of Moses on the left. These are both found within the Bible, but the language is noticeably more archaic than the rest of the text that surrounds them, which have led to speculation that these might be some of the oldest parts of the Bible, dating to perhaps 1200 BCE. Furthermore, in the book of Exodus, there is another song known as Shirat Hayam, or the Song of the Sea, sung by the Israelites after crossing the Red Sea and defeating Pharaoh's army. The even more archaic language is thought at the earliest estimates to be around 2000 BCE. If this is true, it means that the timing wouldn't be far off from the Exodus itself, and perhaps it is an authentic account of the spoken Hebrew of the time. The more, quote, realistic estimate, however, is around 1300 BCE, only a bit earlier than the Song of Moses. Either way, these three songs likely existed as oral tradition within Jewish culture before the major texts were ever written down. I struggled to find what is overly archaic about this text, but one of my guesses would be the word va'araminhu, with the hu ending, where one would usually just see u, which suggests that the third person masculine singular pronoun, hu, had not fully contracted into the conjugation yet. Also, some grammatical features, such as Yashir Moshe, instead of something more typical of biblical Hebrew like Vayashar Moshe, have led some to claim that this was an older form. Furthermore, there are cases where certain words lack the definite article ha, which has been argued to have only been a developing feature at the time, parallel with similar developments that occurred in Akkadian and Aramaic. After these archaic texts, however, the Tehillim, aka Psalms, were written. The Torah was already in possession of the Jewish people, but as I mentioned, it probably wasn't written down fully until the Babylonian exile, perhaps existing only as oral tradition amongst the priestly class, or was written down but was highly inaccessible. After the Tanakh, or Hebrew Bible, we skip a few more centuries ahead to the Babylonian Talmud, which was written down in the aforementioned Mishnaic Hebrew, heavily mixed in with Aramaic, however. This is because the Talmud is not really one text. I won't go into it, but there's the Mishnah, mostly written in Hebrew, and the Gemara, written in Jewish Babylonian Aramaic. Moving on, there's the Masoretic text, the oldest existing full copy of the Hebrew Bible bound together in one book with an order, rather than being a disorganized mess of scrolls. The additional texts and commentaries that often accompanied it are written in Masoretic or medieval Hebrew, as is the Shulchan Aruch, written in 1565 by Yosef Karo, which is perhaps the end of medieval Hebrew. Now, I've told this story many times on this channel before, and once on that video I did with Samarino, but Eliezer ben Yehuda is the man credited with reviving Hebrew as a spoken language. However, I'll be the first to admit he gets too much credit, as a literary revival had already been taking place during the century prior to his amazing work. One revivalist I would like to shine some light upon is Asher Tzvi Ginsberg, known better by his nom de plume, Echad Ha'am. He was a pioneer in what is sometimes called Proto-Zionism, a prominent maskil, and he promoted the use of the Hebrew language amongst the Hebrew people, publishing regular articles in the Russian Hebrew language newspaper Hamelitz, and eventually starting his own journal, Hashiloach. Now that we've got the history out of the way, let's take a look at the phonology of Hebrew. On the top we have modern Hebrew, and on the bottom we have biblical Hebrew. First of all, I'd like to draw attention to the modern letter tzadi, the one in my profile picture, which was originally the characteristically Semitic sound of a pharyngealized S, tzadi. Furthermore, biblical Hebrew had dental fricatives, which were the sparanetized forms of taf and dalet, no longer present in the language. Next, it is debated whether it existed or not, but some scholars argue that biblical Hebrew once possessed the voiceless alveolo-lateral fricative, which later merged with S in the letter sin. Modern South Arabian languages have this sound, so it's not too far-fetched to believe. It is believable, however, that Hebrew once had a voiced velar fricative as the sparanetized form of the letter gimel. Also, although modern and biblical Hebrew have the voiced uvular fricative, it's important to note that these didn't represent the same letters. In modern Hebrew, the sound is associated with the letter resh, as it is Hebrew's main R sound. However, it existed in archaic Hebrew as the equivalent of the Arabic r sound. This was lost later in biblical Hebrew, which is why no written distinction is ever made. But we do know that it was pronounced at one point in time as the Septuagint, the first ever translation of the Hebrew Bible, which was in Greek, recorded place names like Sodom and Gomorrah, even though in the Hebrew Bible it is called Amorah, with no gimel to be seen. Similarly, the Greek transliteration for the city Gaza is Gaza, which again, there is no gimel in the Hebrew name. However, they both begin with the letter Ain, which is historically very fluid with the sound Ghain, as seen in Arabic today. This is why, by the way, the city of Gaza in Arabic today is indeed called Ghazi and not Ghazi. Moving on, however, we have four more phonemes that are not actually lost from modern Hebrew, but still not reflected in their official phonology. These sounds are Hait, Ain, Quf, and Resh. These phonemes are non-standard, meaning they occur in dialects, but not in the standard speech. More on that soon. One thing I'm glad about in modern Hebrew, however, is the simplification of the vowel system, as I would find it otherwise very annoying to have to distinguish between all the long and short vowels. Plus, there were some very annoying rules sometimes inflected in the Nikkud regarding vowels. What are Nikkud, you ask? Well,
Nikkud or nekudot means dots and refers to a system of being able to represent the vowels in the Hebrew script, which usually does not write them. These are used mainly in books designed for children or beginners learning Hebrew, and they are used in religious texts to make it clear how to pronounce the biblical language clearly. However, 99% of the time, Hebrew looks more like this in the modern state of Israel, with no Nikkud to be seen. Trust me, you get used to it, and there is actually a system of using other letters to effectively hint towards a certain vowel. For example, this letter, Vav, officially represents the V sound, but here it is used to let you know that the vowel here is actually an O sound. This becomes incredibly natural over time. When I was talking about phonology, you probably heard me reference spiranetization. That's a pretty rare term, so I will elaborate. It effectively refers to a certain class of consonants which become modified in particular positions around vowels. Interestingly enough, Celtic languages exhibit a similar feature. In Hebrew, there are two terms for this. The most common one that you'll find is beged kefet, which derives its names from the 6 Hebrew letters affected by this sound change. The dot in the middle of a letter is called a dagesh, specifically a dagesh kal in this instance. When no dagesh is present, the sound of these letters are instead spiranetized to these alternate forms. It's worth noting that in modern Hebrew, only bet, kaf, and pei are affected by this, as gimel, dalet, and tav no longer undergo spiranetization. The other term you might very rarely come across is from the Sefer Yetzirah, which calls it beged KAPORET instead. This is because according to the Sefer Yetzirah, the letter resh, or resh in biblical Hebrew, also at one point was affected by the dagesh kal. We only see 17 instances of this throughout the entire Bible and nowhere else, and they are almost always next to a pharyngeal or guttural sound. Therefore, it is thought that a resh with a dagesh kal probably meant that it was trilled in order to emphasize its presence next to a pharyngeal consonant, not to get lost and be otherwise confused. This is at least the teaching of Rav Saadia Gaon. Now, I mentioned dialects before. First of all, we absolutely know that dialects of Hebrew existed in ancient times. The northern kingdom of Israel had its own Hebrew dialect called Israeli Hebrew academically, and it exhibited features different to that of biblical Hebrew, such as the second person feminine pronoun being ati instead of at, and the contraction of asher to she, a feature that would later become very common in Hebrew, but is absent from biblical Hebrew, believed to be a regionalism of the north. The Hebrew spoken in Transjordan also differed, as evidenced by the famous story in the Bible of the Ephraimites who couldn't pronounce the word shibolet, instead pronouncing it in their dialect as sibolet. The idea of a single word being used to identify whether someone belongs to your group or not led to the linguistic term shibboleth being derived from the Hebrew word. In Hebrew, shibolet or shiboleth in biblical Hebrew means oat and also refers to a very good bakery chain that I miss very much. So what about modern Hebrew? Well, regional dialects don't really exist in the same way at all. The closest thing is both the cities of Jerusalem and Tel Aviv having some well-known slang. However, Jerusalem might slowly be developing its own dialect amongst the more religious communities, as some grammatical features are beginning to separate from modern Hebrew. However, some well-known Yerushalmi slang I'd like to highlight are the following. Eshtano instead of lafa, a delicious Iraqi Jewish pita. Ajoim instead of gogoim, referring to apricot kernels. Aboyoyo instead of sakemach, referring to what we would call a piggyback ride in English. The next one I'll let some kind Israeli volunteers explain in the comments because you're in for a nice surprise, but it's basically a different word for a lollipop than the usual name in Hebrew. The next, bambelik instead of shush, meaning licorice. This one is cool because it comes from the Turkish word pembelik. And finally, beit shimush instead of sherutim, meaning bathroom, though I'd never heard this one before, so I'm not sure how common it is. I'm not too educated on Tel Aviv slang, and it's a place I'd prefer to stay away from. So maybe some Israelis could enlighten me on the unique slang too. However, most dialects in Hebrew are better described as ethnolects, usually belonging to several different edot or Jewish subcultures living within Israel. For example, Ashkenazi Hebrew is known for pronouncing taf without a dagesh as s, a remnant of the old voiceless dental fricative. Sephardi Hebrew is actually the basis for modern Hebrew pronunciation, but traditionally their letter sadi softened out to an s instead of becoming a ts cluster like in Ashkenazi Hebrew, leading to them pronouncing matzah as masa and tzaddik as sadiq. Mizrahi dialects generally pronounce those biblical Hebrew consonants I mentioned earlier. In my opinion, these dialects are my favourite, and though I don't speak with Mizrahi pronunciation in modern Hebrew, I do use it for liturgical pronunciation when praying. There's also a notable Russian Hebrew dialect which features a noticeable Russian accent, many Russian slang words used within the language, and exhibits some features of Ashkenazi Hebrew. Russian Israelis are one of the only communities to keep their language and culture even after emigrating to Israel, though they are assimilated to an extent. The children of Russian immigrants often speak fluent Russian, which can't be said for the children of other immigrant groups in Israel, and thus there is now a separate Israeli dialect of the Russian language that is emerging. I must mention that for all of these categories here, they are broad ethnic Jewish subgroups, because there are different kinds of Ashkenazi, there's different kinds of Sephardi, and there's different kinds of Mizrahi. For example, within Mizrahi you have Yemeni and Iraqi, but within Ashkenazi you have Polish and Dutch. Sephardi you have Turkish and Moroccan. So there are different, very slight changes, but for the most part their Hebrew can be dialect groups rather than full dialects themselves, I would say. And these are the ones that you would generally find in modern Israel today. For the next part of the video, I think we should look at some of the main differences between Biblical Hebrew and modern Hebrew. Hopefully this way, you'll know which one you're looking at. First of all, many older spellings can be expected to be found in Biblical Hebrew, particularly ones that have a sneaky O sound that isn't always written, such as koach, tzoraim, and chochmah. You can find a lot of people that still use these spellings, however, including myself. This appears to really annoy the Hebrew Academy, the regulatory body that oversees changes to modern Hebrew, and I can always sleep easy at night knowing that I've done my part in annoying them. Similarly to the last example of a vav being inserted to make it easier to know when there's an O sound, yud might also be inserted to indicate an E sound, such as in these words where the older spellings did not contain the extra yud: aliyah, shniah, and ritzpah. Biblical and Mishnaic Hebrew will use much more archaic terms for places today, such as Eretz Ashkenaz, which is nowadays just Germania, that is Germany. Or another example might be Be'erot, which you usually find an updated version today of Beirut, of course signifying Beirut in Lebanon. There were also words in Biblical Hebrew, which the meanings were not fully known, that have been repurposed in modern Hebrew, such as chashmal, which now means electricity, or zchuchit, which means glass. The original words might have meant something like amber and crystal, respectively, but it's not definitively known. Similarly, new vocabulary had to be created for things and concepts that didn't exist in Biblical Hebrew, such as tomatoes, potatoes, oranges, and computers, which now have new names that were formed from Semitic roots: agvania, tpuach adama, tapuz, and machshev. A significant grammatical feature of Biblical Hebrew was its verb-subject-object-word order. For example, a biblical style sentence might go something like shotea ish et hamayim, meaning the man drinks the water, where the verb lishtot precedes the subject ish. It would be normal in modern Hebrew to express this as hagever shotea et hamayim, with the subject gever, a much more modern term for man, preceding the verb instead. Certain prepositions have just become shortened to either a prefix or just a shorter preposition, such as min, asher, and asher el, contracting to she, mi, and shel, respectively. Shel is very common in modern Hebrew, but non-existent in Biblical Hebrew, and denotes possession. Biblical Hebrew also underwent lexical narrowing. Take these words for example: Zahav, Charutz, Paz, Ophir, Betzel, Sagor, and Ketem, which all mean gold, whereas modern Hebrew just uses Zahav, cognate with Aramaic Dahav and Arabic Dahab. Paz might sometimes be used in certain contexts, but the rest of these words you would only see in religious or poetic contexts. And going back to what I briefly mentioned about possession, Biblical Hebrew uses a system where personal pronouns are conjugated onto the end of a noun as a suffix. For example, Muto means his death, Avatech means your love, and Shlomchem means your peace, in plural. In modern Hebrew, this way of expression can be used, but only in formal situations, otherwise it seems biblical, poetic, or too formal. The way it is now expressed instead is with the preposition shel being used like of. However, the personal pronoun is conjugated onto the word shel, and the noun has to receive a definite article. This means the words would now be hamavet shelo, ha'ava shelach, and hashalom shelachem. A similar process has happened in Masri, the Arabic language of Egypt. You will also spot many words of foreign origin in Hebrew. Firstly, Avir, Sanhedrin, Uchlusia, Achnasiyah, Siman, Basis, and Zug all come from ancient Greek and were loaned in antiquity. Similarly, Adechal, Ikar, Shuk, Saris, Sulam, Tano, and Hechal come from Akkadian. Tismach, Shoshan, Sir, Kerem, Shinhav, and Charmesh come from ancient Egyptian or Coptic. Vilon, Machona, Sabon, Kasda, Kufsa, and Kolmos are all Latin borrowings, and Ulpan, Nadlan, Dugma, Davka, Chutzpah, Sakin, and Zman are examples of common Aramaic words used in everyday Hebrew. In fact, it can be argued that no language has been more influential on Hebrew other than Aramaic, changing grammar, vocabulary, and phonology over time. The majority of the words from these 5 languages found in Hebrew were loaned in ancient times. However, some more recent additions to Hebrew come from the following languages: Chatzil, Taina, Kef, Merkaz, Tzaba, Mehendes, and Lachan are some examples of Arabic words, excluding the numerous Arabic slang that is present in modern Hebrew. During the revival, French became a popular source for vocabulary, leading to words like café, thé, salon, accord, ballon, douche, and champagne. Now, yes, both café and thé are not originally from French, and some revivalists did attempt to introduce a more Arabicized kahve, but it didn't catch on, and the forms used in Hebrew were taken directly from French. Pilpel, Shachmat, Gezer, Dat, Hodu, Geniza, and Etrog are all words originally from Persian, which Hebrew has taken words from both in ancient times and more recent times, which is why I put Persian down here. Finally, the words pogrom, juk, balagan, bambuk, and chaltora are examples of Russian loanwords in Hebrew. Again, there's a lot of slang in modern Hebrew derived from Russian. Balagan is probably the most famous example of that, though it ultimately derives from Old Persian, so there's debate on whether it's a Russian word or a Persian one. Of course, there are loanwords from many other languages too. Sometimes it's just a few words, sometimes it's many. I tried not to include too much slang here, but the bulk of Hebrew slang comes from Arabic, Russian, and English. Moving to grammar now. Hebrew is a Semitic language, as I'm sure you know, and Semitic languages are known for their root system, which are known as shorashim in Hebrew. Roots are usually 3 consonants, sometimes 2, sometimes 4, but mostly 3. Let's take a look at a root that isn't the kaf tav bet root, meaning to write, for once in our lives. Instead, let's take kuf dalet shin, which is related to anything holy or to dedication, both in a religious sense and nowadays a secular sense. Many verbs, nouns, and adjectives can be formed from this one root. Let's take a look at this list. we have lekadesh, the simple verb meaning to sanctify. Lehakdish is to dedicate, and litkadesh is to become sanctified. Kadosh is the adjective meaning holy, whereas kodesh is holiness itself. A mikdash refers to a temple, and our old Jewish temple that once stood on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem was called Beit HaMikdash, literally house of the temple. Kiddush is a word that isn't translated per se. It refers to a Jewish ceremony at the end of prayers on Friday night where we sanctify Shabbat with wine and bread. Don't confuse it with the Kaddish, however, which is a prayer for the dead. I've put this one in red because technically it's Aramaic, not Hebrew, but they share the same root in both languages. Hakdasha is the noun meaning sanctification itself, or dedication or consecration, depending on the context. Finally, there is mukdash, which is the adjective for dedicated, which can be used in secular contexts. For example, if a building is dedicated in the name of the president, there would probably be a plaque saying "Abinyan hazeh mukdash lanasi" or something like that. When you account for gender and number, the amount of words formed from this root becomes even bigger. Wait, did I just say binyan? Of course. Aside from the meaning building, binyan or binyanei hapoel can also refer to grammatical constructions, effectively translating to verbal buildings. There are 7 binyanim, not to be confused with binyamin. These are the following: pa'al, pi'el, hif'il, hitpa'el, huf'al, pe'al, and nif'al. The 3 on the right are passive, the 3 on the left are active, and the one in the middle is reflexive. The 6 on either side are separated into separate grammatical categories, those being simple, intensive, and causative. Now for the grammarians, I hope this made sense to you, because a lot of it I can't really fully explain. But for example, the placeholder root is usually used for grammar, and that is pe, ein, lamed, which comes from the verb meaning to act. Traditionally it meant to make or to do, as its cognate in Arabic still does. Here you can see the root conjugated in different circumstances. Basically, the placement of vowels changes the overall contextual meaning of the verb. This furthermore goes to show how ingenious the root system is. When you account for number, gender, tense, and aspect, you get a table looking something like this. The placeholder root here is kuf, tet, lamed, another root often used to display grammar. But you could replace this with any root in Hebrew and you'd still be able to fill the whole table out like this. It really is amazing, but sadly the grammar puts a lot of people off when they see tables like this. My honest advice is, don't study grammatical tables like this. I couldn't really tell you how they all work, but personally I know how they work when it comes to actually forming sentences and conversations, as I learnt the language in a way in which these verbal constructions eventually become second nature without having to stress over grammar tables like this. And in fact, I think that brings us up to a nice point in which we can move to our final section. So let's say perhaps, maybe because of this video, or maybe because you've been putting it off for a while, but now you think you'd finally like to try learning Hebrew, what do? Well, first of all, establish whether you want to learn Biblical Hebrew, likely for religious purposes, or modern Hebrew, possibly for visiting or even moving to Israel someday. Emigrating to Israel as a Jew is known as making Aliyah, and one of the benefits provided to Olim Chadashim for Aliyah is free access to an Ulpan, a Hebrew learning school for adults. But before you arrive there, it's definitely a good idea to have at least been studying Hebrew for over a year in advance. I'd say it would put you ahead and help you catch up much quicker with everything, so it's worth doing it. You might be asking, why not learn both? Well, the chances are you will learn both, but it's good to focus on one first. And for that, you should prioritize your reasons for studying Hebrew. In my personal experience, it is easier to start out studying modern Hebrew and then move to Biblical Hebrew alongside it later. And this is mostly because Biblical Hebrew is much more difficult, but it's also more similar to formal language register in modern Hebrew, so studying modern Hebrew beforehand will give you an advantage for studying Biblical Hebrew. If you only have an interest in learning Biblical Hebrew, then I advise you pick yourself up a Biblical Hebrew textbook, though there are plenty of websites and YouTube channels such as Aleph with Beth, which specialize in biblical language. Additionally, if you have a nearby synagogue, perhaps discuss it with a rabbi, and he might be willing to help you. If you're lucky enough to live in a bigger community, they might even provide Biblical Hebrew lessons at the synagogue. Also, pick yourself up a Tanakh that is fully in Hebrew. Personally, I highly recommend the Koren Tanakh. Not sponsored. They genuinely make some very beautiful and readable Sifrei Tanakh. Studying Biblical Hebrew will entail in a lot of reading and not much speaking, as it is a liturgical language, though of course different pronunciations for reciting Hebrew are used by different communities, and I would advise you to probably learn the liturgical pronunciation of your community, for example Ashkenazi, Sephardi, etc. Alternatively, if you're a Semitic language nerd like me, you might want to learn how to accurately pronounce Biblical Hebrew with all its pharyngeal and guttural sounds. If you're interested in learning modern Hebrew, however, by and large it's much easier. All the sounds already exist in English except for 2.5, the half a sound being tzadi, because it does exist in English, but only when a vowel precedes it, and thus you need to learn how to enunciate it at the beginning of a word, which isn't too difficult to get the hang of. You can practice it by saying tsa, tse, tsi, tso, tsu. The other two sounds are the Hebrew R sound, resh, which I struggle with from time to time in certain clusters, but it's essentially a softer version of the French or German R sound. Finally, there's also chet or chaf. They're the same sound in modern Hebrew. This is made in the same place in the throat that the resh is made in. It's just voiceless. Once you've got the hang of sounds and knowing which letters in the Aleph Bet they correspond with, I would then advise that you begin the Hebrew course on Duolingo. I am in no way sponsored, and I will admit the course needs a lot of work and grammar isn't explained very well, but in terms of learning new vocabulary and revising it over and over, Duolingo is a very useful tool for at least building and memorizing that vocabulary in the first place. However, being a modern language, the best way is to, of course, interact with native speakers, listen to conversations, try and speak yourself, etc. Sadly, we don't always have the luxury of being able to visit the Holy Land, but you might find Hebrew-speaking communities in large cities across the Jewish world, like New York and London, and of course you can watch content online. Try to mix reading with watching, and when it comes to the news, for example, and to check out some Hebrew shows on Netflix, like Fauda, which is one of my favourites. Also, I don't want to make this video without mentioning Piece of Hebrew, my favourite Hebrew learning channel on YouTube. Honestly, these guys have helped me so much over the last few years, and there is no other channel on YouTube that compares to them. You'll find videos on a variety of different topics, on different levels, for different learners. Again, I couldn't possibly recommend them more. A website I really recommend too is Pealim, again from the Poel root, and this website has honestly saved my life when it comes to grammar. Plus they have a load of cool articles with other useful information for learning. Also, it goes without saying, but reading books in Hebrew is a good way to improve. However, books are usually written in more formal language, so it doesn't beat being able to speak with native speakers where possible. And before you ask, no, you do not need to be Jewish to speak Hebrew. There are plenty of people that are not Jewish who speak Hebrew. Some, for example, are Christians who want to be able to understand their original texts much better. However, I think I've said pretty much all there is to say on this matter, so with that I will conclude this video now. Thank you all for watching. This was of course a very long video, but I wanted to be able to cover as much as possible without rambling on too much, of course. It could have been longer. I hope you all learned some fascinating things you probably did not know before, and if any of you are studying or want to study Hebrew, tell me why in the comments. Furthermore, speakers of any other Semitic language are also welcome to compare their knowledge in the comments. With that, I wish you all a good week. Shabbat Shalom if you're watching this a day late, and I will see you in the next video. Toda Rabba ve Yalla bye.